Hello everyone, today is April 27th, 2026, and welcome back to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. For today's video, I wanted to cover the 2026 United States Senate election in the state of Massachusetts. The Senate election here in the state of Massachusetts is not actually one that's going to be competitive when it comes to the general election in the fall. As you can see, Massachusetts is actually a very solidly Democrat state. It's actually within the top 5 most Democratic states in the country, where you can see here in the 2020 Senate election, incumbent Ed Markey actually ended up winning by over 33 percentage points. So why am I covering this video for the 2026 US Senate election if this is not going to be a contested contest at all in the November general election? The reason for the coverage is actually because of the intensifying Democratic primary that's occurring right here, where incumbent Senator Ed Markey is facing off against challenger Seth Moulton, which is a U.S. representative from the Massachusetts 6th District, in which he's been an incumbent U.S. House member for around a decade now, nearly 10 years, and he is trying to primary out Ed Markey. Now, Representative Seth Moulton ended up launching his campaign a few months ago in a bid to unseat Ed Markey, with his main message and argument stating that Ed Markey is way too old to be continuing in the United States Senate, and that he should not be running for another 6-year term at 80 years old, which will be the time that Ed Markey begins his continuous Senate term. Now, if you were to begin his continuous Senate term at 80 years old, that means by the time his term would come to an end that he'd be 86 years old, which would be one of the oldest United States senators in modern time to still be in Congress if Ed Markey were to be reelected and finish out his term. So Seth Moulton ended up launching his bid at the end of last year, around October, and has since been making shockwaves in the state of Massachusetts, with many voters being divided between the two, deciding who they're going to end up supporting in the primary. Ed Markey has been adamant, saying that he's going to continue seeking his third term in 2026, despite him being 80 years old, claiming that him being 80 years old should not be a factor and that he's still fit and the right person for the job compared to Seth Moulton. Now, if you go back to the Democratic primary, you can see that those are really the only two name brand or recognizable candidates here in the Democratic primary, in which Ed Markey has received a lot of endorsements from the progressive side of the state, and Seth Moulton, only being a U.S. House representative, has only received a few endorsements, mainly from blue-collar labor unions within the state of Massachusetts. This primary has become a divide among voters, with many of them agreeing that Ed Markey will be too old to lead the Democrats in Massachusetts, while some of them are actually disagreeing, saying it doesn't matter how old he is, that they do not want Seth Moulton to be in the Senate. What is some of the policies Ed Markey is currently bringing that Seth Moulton is not currently bringing? Well, Seth Moulton does have a bit more of the moderate and blue-collar backing, which Ed Markey does not have, where Ed Markey is seen as a progressive firebrand in the state of Massachusetts. This being Massachusetts, a lot of people think of the progressive Democrat Elizabeth Warren without really knowing that her fellow senator from Massachusetts is also one of the most progressive senators in the entire United States Congress in history, being Ed Markey. Now, a lot of people who do know end up realizing this, and a lot of the most progressive voters in the Democratic primary are continuing to back Markey despite his old age, which is also conflicting because the majority of radical and or progressive voters in the state of Massachusetts also happen to be the youngest ones. Well, we're actually seeing a lot of these young progressive voters deciding to vote for someone who will be 80 years old solely because of their opposition to Seth Moulton. What is the actual opposition to Seth Moulton that these progressive voters are arguing as their reason for why they're continuing to back an 80-year-old Ed Markey? This all comes back to 2024, where Kamala Harris ended up losing the election to Donald Trump, where Representative Seth Moulton ended up making comments about trans athletes, where we can see here on this article, Representative Seth Moulton from Massachusetts ended up giving some constructive criticism to the Democratic side after the failure of the 2024 presidential bid from Kamala Harris, where he said Democrats spend way too much time not trying to offend anyone rather than being brutally honest about the challenges many Americans face. Mr. Moulton then said, "I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete, but as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that." Where Seth Moulton, in this article and in this argument, seems to infer that Democrats have gone way too far under transgender messaging, specifically when it comes to transgender minors or transgender students in the education system, arguing that transgender boys do not belong in women's sports, saying that he fears for his own daughters and that he's too scared to speak out because of what the Democrats will do to him. Now, shortly after he made those comments, His point actually ended up being proved correctly, where the Democratic Party in the state of Massachusetts all began to degrade him, and he received massive backlash from the Democratic Party for his comments about trans athletes, which he then said proves his point, because he said that if he were to give any differing ideas or critiques about this policy issue, that the Democrats will try to instill fear into him, preventing him from saying more. So after this announcement, a lot of the progressive and more left-wing side of the Democrats ended up turning on Representative Moulton. A lot of them vowed to set up a primary challenge against him and never vote for him again because of those comments. Now, if you actually go back into Representative Moulton's voting record, you can see that after he said those statements, he did double down by defending himself, saying that Democrats proved his points because of all the attacks that he received directly after. And he also then went to go on how saying that including pronouns in signatures and emails is something that he quotes as kind of weird, which then began to infuriate more of the left-wing Democrats in the state of Massachusetts and as a nation as a whole, where fellow Democrats began to call him a cooperator in Nazi times for daring to offer a different side on what the mainstream Democratic consensus is on the progressive end in Massachusetts, with many Democrats vowing to quote-unquote find someone to run against Moulton in the Democratic primaries for the 2026 midterm elections due to his comments. So essentially, the entire Democratic Party in the state of Massachusetts ended up turning on him for these comments. And even after the initial doubling down, Moulton then backtracked, saying that many people in the media and the Democrats misrepresented what his position on transgender issues were following the election, and he began to backtrack, saying that Republicans are actually the ones taking away the issue and that he was just advocating for more debate. Contrary to what he initially said, where he was not saying that they should have more debate, he was actually giving his opinion on a policy stance. But he eventually ended up backtracking the statement, saying that it was others who misrepresented him. Moving along, a lot of the Democrats didn't buy his apology because they pointed out how he was just reconstruing the argument and not actually defending what he initially said anymore, in which a lot of the progressives and Democrats continued to berate him because of his policy messages and his signaling that he made to Kamala Harris after the election loss. Now, when it comes to Moulton's actual voting record, we can see that Moulton, despite him offering his constructive criticism after the election, showing that he did make a lot of messages advocating against boys and women's sports. However, when push came to shove, he actually did end up agreeing with all of the Democrats, saying that a bill banning boys from women's sports would actually be going too far, essentially making all of his conflicting messages earlier useless because he didn't actually change none of his voting positions, and instead he just offered an opinion that went against him and ended up hurting his standing within the Democratic Party. Now, this is what makes the 2026 primary so interesting, because we have two factions. Democrats who see the party going a little bit too extreme might be backing Seth Moulton because they see him as a bit more moderate, despite his voting record pretty much staying exactly the same regardless of the comments he makes. Whereas you see a lot of young and progressive voters trying to back Ed Markey because they view him as the most progressive candidate in this race, regardless of the voting positions. The only issue here is that Ed Markey is 80 years old, so a lot of young Democrat progressive voters are kind of looking themselves in the mirror saying, are we really backing the person who's 80 years old? And they're trying to convince themselves that yes, they're backing him because he is the most progressive. And despite Seth Moulton being nearly half the age of Ed Markey and being able to continue and live a lot longer in the United States Senate, they're convinced to vote against him because Ed Markey is the more progressively aligned candidate of their choice. Now, with that being said, where do the polls currently stand? I did go over some of the endorsements for Ed Markey and Seth Moulton, but let's go into the fundraising, where Seth Moulton is actually showing a good challenge and actually has more money cash on hand than Ed Markey does. So an 80-year-old incumbent in the United States Senate in Massachusetts actually has nearly $1 million less than Seth Moulton, who is the challenger in this bid. So Seth Moulton has done a good job at the fundraising, where he's a little bit behind on the fundraising, but he's in the advantage when it comes to cash on hand before the primary occurs. However, the problem for Seth Moulton begins in the primary polling, where in the initial poll done by Republicans, presumably with a more moderate and/or Republican bias, show Seth Moulton only winning by 8 percentage points with 32 undecided. Now, if you look at the polls since then, all the way until now, ranging from October all the way to April 2026, you can see that none of these polls have been funded by one of these candidates, despite one of them being a Democratic internal, but pretty much all of them show Seth Moulton losing to Ed Markey anywhere from 20 points all the way down to a few percentage points, where Ed Markey ends up coming out victorious from nearly all of these polls. But the fact that a 3-term progressive incumbent in one of the most progressive states in the country, Massachusetts, is only polling at 46% against a more moderate challenger is a signal that Ed Markey does need to take this race seriously. But with that being said, how serious is serious for Ed Markey? And the reason I say that is because back in 2020, Ed Markey had this exact same sort of challenger. If you recall, in the 2020 United States Senate election, despite Ed Markey winning in a landslide against Republicans in the general, he actually had one of the most competitive primaries for Democrats in the United States Senate that year, where Ed Markey was running off and fighting against Joe Kennedy III, the former U.S. House Representative from Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District, and grandson of RFK, Robert F. Kennedy. The Kennedy name in Massachusetts is legendary. The Kennedys have represented Massachusetts for decades. The Kennedys have been elected to presidential office, attorney general offices, have been a name brand in Massachusetts state and national politics for nearly half a century. So you would think that a Kennedy entering the race, especially one tied to the direct bloodline and a grandson of RFK, would put up a fight, if not outbeat Ed Markey when it comes to the primary elections. However, you can see here that Joe Kennedy III actually ended up losing to Ed Markey, where the Kennedy name actually failed to win an election in the Democratic primary. You can see here, even in the fundraising, Joe Kennedy was nearly caught up with Ed Markey in the fundraising as a challenger. However, when it came to the polling, Joe Kennedy was behind by around 12 percentage points, which ended up coming true as the Democratic results showed him losing by approximately 11% to Ed Markey. The progressive firebrand of Ed Markey was able to beat long-standing legacy and nepotism in the state of Massachusetts. In reality, my interpretation of where this race stands is that Seth Moulton really does not have a chance at winning this election against Ed Markey. I believe that if Ed Markey was not able to lose to Joe Kennedy, and Ed Markey actually ended up beating Joe Kennedy by a sizable amount back in 2020, I really doubt and I really have a hard time seeing Seth Moulton being able to overcome a 15-point polling deficit against Ed Markey. Now, the primary election does occur in September 1st, 2026, which is an entire 5 months from now, and there's a lot that can change between now and then. However, with Massachusetts being one of the most progressive states in the country, I feel as though a lot of young voters, a lot of progressive voters, and even a lot of the coalition Democrat voters in Massachusetts are just way too progressive and way too left-wing to be nominating and voting for someone like Seth Moulton when they have an option and an incumbent U.S. Senator in Ed Markey who will push their progressive agenda in the United States Senate presumably a lot farther than Seth Moulton ever would. So for my final prediction here, I think that the Democrats are going to get the progressive candidate they want out of this race. I think that Seth Moulton is pulling a lot of time and a lot of money from the more moderate side of the Democratic base in the state of Massachusetts to try to primary out Ed Markey. However, I feel as though Ed Markey is going to come out victorious, although he is spending a lot of money just to pull this thorn out of his side that is trying to primary him. So I believe this is going to be interesting to see how Democrats continue or may not continue infighting in the state of Massachusetts. Will the Democrats in this state end up realizing that Ed Markey is the favored candidate here and Seth Moulton should drop out so that they can coalesce behind one Democratic candidate, instead of wasting a lot of time, energy, and money in this race when there are a lot more crucial Senate races that could be taking place throughout this year? So with that being said, everyone, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Do you believe that Seth Moulton has what it takes to unseat incumbent Ed Markey? Or do you think that the progressive Democrats in the state have too strong of a firewall to let Ed Markey fall? Go ahead and let me know down below in the comments. If you also have any video suggestions, please let them be known down below in the comments. Now, if you all enjoyed this video, make sure to click the like button and also click subscribe down below on the YouTube video. I'll be uploading more videos this week and I'm looking forward to seeing you all then. Have a good one.